That's something I have hunted high and low, John, to try and figure out exactly where that came from. Because the original Malachi 4, 5, and 6 comes out of British Israelism. Then through latter rain, it evolved into what we had in the Message. And to the best of my knowledge, John, Paul Cain is the man who transitioned that Elijah prophecy from a single Elijah to the whole corporate church.
Oh, wow. Yeah,
and so that idea that there's going to be a whole generation of Elijahs, I believe Paul Cain is very likely the man who originated that teaching. And he did that in the years after William Branham died, while he was one of the Kansas City prophets. I've not been able to find another person preaching that before him. And so that really leads me to believe that it's quite likely he is the one who originated that teaching, which came directly out of the Message, which again we know we can trace it all the way came back out of British Israelism. So I find that incredibly interesting. And Mike Bickle and the other Kansas City prophets really popularized that idea coming into the 1990s, which again I believe originated with Paul Cain, who adapted it out of the theology of the Message.
Yeah, it's just really unbelievable because William Branham died, and all of these guys were promoting, like Paul Cain, who's William Branham's proxy. He's William Branham's mouthpiece for the Message, the quote-unquote Message, which was the latter rain message. Well, after he died, most of the things that William Branham said died with him. Most of the prophecies that really required him to be alive died with him. And so all of these men try to take what was there and they transition it into this new thing. And it becomes a new prophecy. It doesn't even resemble the old one. But again, what were they thinking? These people who knew this, these people who had heard these prophecies, they said, oh yeah, it's okay. We'll change it to this new thing and we'll go with you.
My goodness. One more little interesting tidbit about Paul Cain. Most of his really famous miracles from the healing revival days occurred at the Calvary Temple in Los Angeles, which was Leroy Copp's church. And I find that really interesting because we know that's the same place that some of William Branham's most famous miracles happened, like the Congressman Upshaw healing, right?
Yeah.
Which we know was a hoax. And we have pretty decent evidence that, I think that Leroy Copp was involved in going along and perpetrating some of these hoaxes. And we have pretty solid evidence that Roy Davis was connected to that church as well, So there's possible Roy Davis connections here with Paul Cain's stuff going on there at that church. And so Leroy Copp, the pastor of that church, he was also vice chairman of the Foursquare denomination in Evangelists. And very interestingly, he was mentally unstable, right? He was hospitalized. He was in a sanatorium multiple times. And he was the man who served as the corroborating witness on the majority of Paul Cain's miracles that were published in Voice of Healing. So I find that pretty suspicious, if you ask me. Yeah, that's
crazy. And I'll never forget the first time that I saw he had escaped from a sanitarium. These are men who, when William Branham was struggling the most, the Copps, you take the, what's it called, the 20th Century Prophet video, this is what picked William Branham back up off the ground. And these men are collaborating together to help keep this thing from dying, because it is a money train. And Paul Cain, again, when William Branham died, he had to keep this money train going. And Leroy Copp, who's involved with this thing, Paul Copp, they're straight out of the Angelus Temple. This is the church that had Wesley Swift and had Gerald Winrod. These very horrific things were a backbone to their ministry. I'm not saying that they continued them, by no means, from what we can tell, but these guys were trained under this teaching, very, very wrong, very strongly opposed to Christianity, what they were brought up with. Well, these are the same guys who are taking William Branham and lifting him up, and now after Branham dies, these guys do the same thing with Paul Cain.
So I mentioned that Calvary Temple in Los Angeles because I am pretty sure that's where Paul Cain met Chuck Smith and started working with him. And so Chuck Smith was Paul Cain's campaign manager, and was alongside Paul Cain through a lot of the healing revival years and latter rain years. And after 1965, when Paul Cain disappeared for that period of time, Chuck Smith took over a relatively small church called Calvary Chapel. And I've tried to put the pieces together. I'm not sure about this. It could be that Calvary Chapel was a continuation of Leroy Kopp's church. I've not been able to quite perfectly figure that out, so I'm not sure. I would like to find more pieces, but I believe it is likely that Chuck Smith's Calvary Chapel was a continuation of Leroy Kopp's Calvary Temple. And Calvary Chapel grew into a really massive charismatic denomination under Chuck Smith's leadership. And one interesting thing about Calvary Chapel, too, when the shepherding movement imploded and broke up, shepherding movement, that's the cult that Derek Prince and Ern Baxter and Don Basham and those guys created. When it broke up after all the abuses that happened in the shepherding movement, there was a lot of the shepherding movement churches exited and merged into Calvary Chapel. So Calvary Chapel is descended from two of the main branches of the latter rain in that way. And Calvary Chapel is a huge, huge group that was influenced quite a bit by Paul Cain via Chuck Smith. And let me just say here, not every group we're talking about in these podcasts is a bad group. And I really don't have any bad thing to say about Calvary Chapel. I just want to put that out there today. You know, Chuck Smith predicted the end of the world and the week of Daniel would start, I think, in 1981. And, of course, that didn't happen. And after that didn't happen, it seems like Calvary Chapel started to reform itself in a lot of ways, honestly. And when they took in the refugees from the shepherding movement, I think that brought them maybe some awareness of the dangers of the latter rain movement. And as far as I know, Calvary Chapel today has rejected a lot of the most dangerous cultic elements of the latter rain and have largely reformed. So, you know, just in case, you know, Mike Winger or somebody like that ever listens to this, I want to be clear, I'm not throwing Calvary Chapel under the bus, but this is where Calvary Chapel come from. This is the reality of the history of their movement, where they come from. Calvary Chapel is a cousin to the Message.
Yeah. You know, it's really sad because there were a lot of people involved with all of this stuff that really had good intentions, but they were manipulated to believe very bad things, very wrong things. So you can't say everybody, even the ministers who were bringing some of these very heretical doctrines, you can't say that their heart was impure. They really tried to do what was right. But you've got this group of men that were just seeded with very, very bad people who unfortunately were listened to because the latter rain had no checks and balances. So like you, I don't have anything negative to say, but this whole thing was part of a much broader movement.
So Calvary Chapel is one of the largest charismatic organizations today. I believe they have at least 1,500 churches, maybe more than that. So that's one group. So eventually, by the late 1970s, Paul Cain reemerged from wherever he was and whatever he was doing. And he got involved with Mike Bickle in Kansas City,